بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. In this session, we're going to be looking at two sections of the chapter pertaining to prayer. That is the prohibited times of prayer, and then after that, we're going to look at congregational prayer. So the first section we're looking at is prohibited times, awqat al-nahi. So awqat al-nahi, the great Imam Buhuti opens up, wa awqat al-nahi, the prohibited times, basically include the following. And he's going to mention 5 times, which can be summarized into 3 times. So there are times in which it is prohibited to pray. And considering the previous section, which was all about voluntary prayer, when we're talking about all of the extra prayers that can be done, it's important to note that there are times of the day in which prayer should not be made. And there, of course, are exceptions to this general rule. So he begins to highlight these times. He says, مِن طُلُوءِ الْفَجْرِ حَتَّى تَرْتَفِعَ الشَّمْسُ قَدْرَ رُمْحٍ. Begins here, he says, وَإِنَّ قِيَامِهَا حَتَّى تَزُولَ وَمِن صَلَاةِ الْعَصْرِ حَتَّى يَتِمَّ الْغُرُوبَ. So first and foremost, the first time he says, from the commencement of al-Fajr. He says, مِن طُلُوءِ الْفَجْرِ. Now this is not when Fajr prayer is prayed, but this is when the Fajr time starts. It's the difference between when you pray Fajr and when Fajr starts. Because normally there's the adhan, and then you're going to wait, and there's the iqamah, etc. And why I'm making this distinction is because when we get to Salat al-Asr, we'll see that that time is all about when the prayer is actually performed. So it's from the beginning of al-Fajr al-Thani. Al-Fajr al-Thani, which is the time when the adhan is called for Salat al-Fajr until the sun rises. It says, حَتَّى تَرْتَفِعَ الشَّمْسُ. Until the sun rises. And this is based on the hadith which states, when al-Fajr commences, there is no prayer except the 2 rak'ahs of Fajr. This is reported by al-Tabarani, and Imam Ahmad used this as evidence, a sufficient hujjah. So this is the first time. طلوع الفجر حتى ترتفع الشمس. The second time is from sunrise, and the sunrise begins when the top of the sun rises above the horizon. So if you take the sun, it's a disk. If we think about it in that way, in a 2-dimensional way, when we look at it, we see a circle. So the very top of that, the top sliver of the sun, when it breaches the horizon, sunrise has begun. So this is the beginning of the second prohibited time, when the sun begins to rise above the horizon, until the sun reaches, he says, قَدْرَ رُمْحٍ, the height of a spear. It's noted by Ibn Qa'id, بِرَأْيِ الْعَيْنِ, as witnessed by the human eye. Not any other measurement. This is just kind of, you're observing. This is what you observe as the onlooker. Now, according to Ibn Muflih, in his book Al-Mubdi', he says the height of a spear, qadru rumh, is referring to al-rumh al-ma'ruf, the well-known spear. A well-known spear or lance. As opposed to some other possible interpretation or understanding of al-rumh, like is it a star or a constellation or something. He says the height of a spear is referring to the well-known spear, meaning the weapon that's used to stab and to throw. And this is further demonstrated in another hadith that we're talking about, this type of spear, if you will. And this hadith states, and by the way, the hadith is from Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, when he was asked about what happened during the migration. And he began to explain what happened to him and the Prophet ﷺ. And this hadith is found in Sahih Muslim until it gets to the point. He says, ثُمَّ he says, حَتَّى إِذَا دَنَا مِنَّا فَكَانَ بَيْنَنَا وَبَيْنَهُ قَدْرَ رُمْحٍ أَوْ رُمْحَيْنِ أَوْ ثَلَاثَةٍ. So this goes to show that the spear was not just used as a measuring stick or a term of measurement for the prayer or associated with the prayer, but it was used in other circumstances to describe distance. And this portion that I read from the hadith, this hadith found in Musnad Imam Ahmad, he says, until they drew near to us. And he was talking about the bounty hunters as they were looking for the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. They had escaped from Mecca. There was a search party looking for them. And in the hadith, it gets to the point, he says, until they drew near to us, while they were hiding in the cave, to the point that between us and them was the distance of a spear or two or three. And this is when the Prophet ﷺ said, La tahzan, inna Allah ma'na. Do not be worried or anxious, for indeed Allah is with us. So that is to show and to highlight the usage of the term rumh, or the spear, as a tool of measurement. Because al-rumh, this spear, was known during the time. In the Arab, they had a particular spear that they would utilize in battle, and it was of a particular height, much like you would find of different weaponry like swords. Arabian swords, or Viking swords, or samurai swords, or etc. They all typically have a certain shape and a type of expected size in which they're fashioned and made. And so that's what it's referring to. There's another hadith that also demonstrates this when it comes to prayer. That the qadru rumh, or the rumh, being used as a measurement stick. This is the hadith found in Sahih Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, ثُمَّ صَلِّ, this is the middle of the hadith, ثُمَّ صَلِّ فَإِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ مَشْهُودَةٌ مَحْضُورَةٌ حَتَّى يَسْتَقِلَّ الظِّلُّ بِالرُّمْحِ ثُمَّ أَقْصِرْ عَنِ الصَّلَاةِ. He says, then pray. He's talking about again, this is related to prohibited times of prayer. He says, then pray, for the prayer is witnessed and angels are attendant to it. That's what's the meaning of the hadith. Till the shadow becomes about the breadth of a spear. It says, حَتَّى يَسْتَقِلُّ الظِّلُّ بِالرُّمْحِ. Then cease prayer. Right? So here he's talking about the same thing. ثُمَّ أَقْصِرْ عَنِ الصَّلَاةِ. So the spear is referenced here, and it's referenced in multiple different occasions. It pertains to the prayer, and it's utilized in various different madhabs to talk about when to pray Eid al-Fitr or Eid al-Adha. And there is a difference of opinion regarding what the standard height of the spear may be. So in the works of Hanabila, you're hard-pressed to find them explaining what that height is. But you would find it perhaps in other madhahib. The Malikis, for example, they say that the height of the, to my knowledge at least, the height of the rumh is 12 shibrs, which is the hand, in height. That's the standard for them. Then there may be some that explain it to be a little bit higher, or a little bit taller, or a little bit shorter. However, it is explained in such a way that it's referring to the actual spear. So that highlights for us the second time. The third time is at its zenith, meaning when the sun is at its zenith, and that is when it reaches the peak in the sky until it falls, meaning until it passes the meridian. And the meridian is, of course, the line that is drawn on that peak along the celestial sphere. Celestial sphere meaning that if you were to draw a sphere around the globe outside, like here's the globe, the earth, and there's a sphere that went around it, they call that the celestial sphere, and that's how they map the constellations. And they have lines which they utilize, and one of those is the meridian, which is when the sun is at its peak. So the meridian, once it passes that meridian, the slightest degree, then the time has concluded. And this is based on a hadith found in Sahih Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, there are 3 times in which the Prophet ﷺ prohibited us from praying and burying our dead. At sunrise, until it rises in the sky. When the sun is at its peak, this is the point here, until it falls. When it is close to sunset, until it sets. So there it gives us 3 basic times. Within that are 5 times. And so the next one we're looking at is the 4th time. And this is from the completion of Asr prayer. And this is meaning the completion of it being prayed and not the end of its time. But when Asr prayer is prayed, so that means it can be an individual thing. Your prohibited time associated with Asr is respective to when you performed Asr prayer, even if it was prayed combined with Dhuhr, at the time of Dhuhr. Okay? Or prayed alone, whether you did it in congregation or you prayed it alone. If you prayed it taqdeeman or ta'khiran with Dhuhr prayer, either delayed or advanced, once Asr prayer is completed, then that time begins and concludes when the sun begins to set. If one doesn't pray Asr, even after the Asr prayer time has entered, they're permitted to perform voluntary prayers until they do so. So the Asr then is called, you can still perform voluntary prayers up until you perform the Asr prayer. It's also permitted to pray voluntary prayers if one were to begin Asr, but they do not finish it. They started it and they severed their prayer. And then they prayed a voluntary prayer. Or if they began Asr prayer and then intended to change the Asr prayer to a voluntary prayer. They changed their intention to just being a nafila, mutlaqa. That means the Asr prayer wasn't concluded. And this is based on hadith which states there is no prayer after Asr prayer until the sun sets. This is found in Sahih Muslim. The sunnah of Dhuhr when combined with Asr, that's the question. Right, so if one's traveling and you're going to make a combination of prayers, Dhuhr and Asr together, and you're going to pray the Ratibah, for example, of Dhuhr, al-Ba'diyah, al-Qabliyah, right before Dhuhr prayer, obviously you understand, you pray your Ratibah Qabla Dhuhr, but then there's one which is after Dhuhr. And the deal with that is, if you're going to combine the prayer, Dhuhr and Asr together, you can't separate them with anything. Otherwise, you've invalidated the combination. And now you have to wait to pray Asr for later. Unless, of course, it was delayed. So that means you would have to forego Ratibat al-Dhuhr al-Ba'diyah. And so in this case, you would pray that after Asr prayer. Even if the combination of the prayers, meaning Dhuhr with Asr is delayed to Asr time. So in either case, you prayed it early or you prayed it delayed, you would make that Ratibat al-Dhuhr after you prayed Salat al-Asr. So you could avoid interrupting the combination of prayers. And this is based on a hadith of Salama, which states that the Prophet ﷺ prayed 2 rak'ahs after Asr. She said, so I asked him about them, right? Because it's a prohibited time. He said, a group of people from Abd al-Qais, they came to me and distracted me from the 2 rak'ahs after Dhuhr. And the ones that I prayed, those 2, they were those. Explaining to her why he was praying in a prohibited time, basically that he was making up that Ratibat al-Dhuhr, and this hadith is found in Sahih Bukhari. And because the hadith does not mention travel, because it doesn't mention travel, the author of Ash-Sharh al-Kabir was of the view that it was permissible to make up the Ratibatu al-Dhuhr after Asr prayer. That was his opinion based on this hadith. However, the madhab is that you would have to wait to make it up later. So you have one view and you have another view. The 5th time commences when the sun begins to set until sunset completes. And the sunset is complete when, again, the sun, the circle of the sun, drops below the horizon entirely. And this is, of course, as indicated in the previously mentioned hadith. The Prophet ﷺ, he says There's no prayer after Asr prayer until the sun sets. Okay? So that gives us a definition of what the prohibited times are, with some evidence to support that. Imam Bahuti says, وَيَجُوزُ قَضَاءُ الْفَرَائِضِ فِيهَا. Basically, now he's starting to give us the exceptions to the rule. What are you permitted to pray during prohibited times? وَيَجُوزُ قَضَاءُ الْفَرَائِضِ فِيهَا. It is permissible to pray the following during them. He begins with of course, we're talking about prohibited times, the make-up obligatory prayers. So if you missed the prayer, and now you've remembered it, or you're going to make it up, and it happens to be a prohibited time, then it's permissible for you to do so. And this is based on the generality of the hadith, which states, whoever sleeps through a prayer or forgets it, they are to pray it when they remember. This is muttafaqun alayh. And whoever manages to pray one rak'ah of Asr before the sun sets is to finish their prayer. Muttafaqun alayh. Okay, so you're basically praying the rest of your Asr prayer while the sun is setting, which is a prohibited time. He says it's also permissible to, for this Ibn Qayyim, it's also permissible to perform prayers obligated by way of a vow. This is by way of nadhr. If you made a vow, whether you made a general vow, I'm going to pray such a prayer, or you specified the time, I'm going to pray it at this time, and it happens to be a prohibited time. You could have even said, I'm going to pray it during that prohibited time. Then it's permissible to do so because the vows are mandatory, and they resemble obligatory prayers in that regard. Basically, because it's permissible to make up mandatory prayers during the prohibited times, by extension, it's permissible to perform an obligatory prayer, which means those which are obligatory by way of a vow. After that, he says, وَرَكَّعْتَا الطَّوَافِ. The two rakahs associated with tawaf, and this is based on hadith which states, O people of Abd Minaf, do not prevent anyone from making tawaf around this house and praying in it at any time they desire, be it day or night. And this is found in Sunnah Tirmidhi. These two rakahs of tawaf are a part of tawaf. And because tawaf is permitted at any time, these two rakahs are permitted along with them. You make tawaf 7 times, and it's concluded with rak'atayn. So if it's during a prohibited time, you're going to finish your tawaf, and you're going to finish that tawaf with rak'atayn. And so, based on the generality of this hadith, it's not very, it's quite specific in praying it. Do not prevent them from making tawaf or praying in it at any time they desire, be it day or night. And he's talking about those prayers that are associated with tawaf. He says, وَإِعَادَةُ جَمَاعَةٍ أُقِيمَتْ وَهُوَ بِالْمَسْجِدِ. Repeating a congregational prayer which has been established while one is in the masjid. Based on a hadith which states, pray the prayers on time, and if they are then established while you are in the masjid, pray, and do not say, I already prayed, so I will not pray. And this hadith is found in Musnad Imam Ahmad and Sahih Muslim. Okay? If one is not in the masjid, it is not recommended that he enter to repeat them inside. If one is not already in the masjid. So here, this means that while you're in the masjid, you prayed, and it's going to be established again. And we're going to talk about that in greater detail shortly. He says, وَرَكَّعْتَا فَجْرٍ قَبْلَ فَرْضِهِ. And the 2 rakahs of Fajr, meaning this is the Ratibatul Fajr or Sunnatul Fajr before its obligation. Before you pray the obligatory Fajr prayer. Because remember that the Waqt al-Nahi begins at Tulu al-Fajr al-Thani. So once the Adhan of Fajr is called, that's it. The prayer is prohibited. You can't perform a voluntary prayer. Except these 2 Rak'ata al-Fajr, the Sunnah of Fajr prayer. says it is not permissible to make the sunnah of Fajr after the obligatory prayer until the sun rises to the height of a spear. Because the exception here is وَرَكَعْتَا فَجْرٍ قَبْلَ فَرْضِهِ. He says, before its obligation is fulfilled. وَيَحْرُمُ تَطَوُّعٌ بِمَا عَدَاهَا فِيهَا حَتَّى مَا لَهُ سَبَبٌ. Praying anything else, including situational prayers. This is مَا لَهُ سَبَبٌ. Within these times is impermissible, according to the madhab. And that includes the prostration of recitation, the eclipse prayer, making up a ratibah, what we mentioned before about the ratibatul asr, that was associated, according to the madhab, is associated with travel. If it's not, then it would not be permitted to make it up. A ratibah after Salat al-Asr, you would have to wait until the prohibited time ended. Next is greeting the masjid. This is tahiyatul masjid, is prohibited during the waqt al-nahi, unless during the khutbah. The sunnah of wudu, the prayer associated with istikhara, or a funeral prayer, unless it's after Fajr or Asr, and this is due to potential worry over the deceased, the body. Meaning that it would be waiting around too long. Right after Fajr prayer, it's a long time. It could be considered a long time until the sun has risen. Or after Asr prayer, it's a long time until Salat al-Maghrib, and so there may be some worry over the body. And if in that case, then you could perform the prayer. Imam Bahuti concluded that this exception was also valid during the shorter times, the shorter prohibited times, like when the sun is at its height or when it's rising or setting, if there is also worry over the body, meaning you just absolutely need to get it into the grave. You can't let it sit around. And this prohibition is also it also includes offering a funeral prayer in absentia, meaning that this is Salatul Ghaib. It's prohibited to perform Salatul Ghaib during the prohibited times, or as Salat عند القبر, which you can pray. You can pray Salat al-Janaza عند القبر. Like if you missed it, for example. You can go to the graveside and you can pray Salat al-Janaza. But if it's a prohibited time, you cannot, because the initial funeral prayer was prayed or permitted to be prayed during a prohibited time because there was worry over the body. But now that the body has been buried or the funeral prayer has already been made, the worry is no longer present. Meaning that praying in the prohibited time, prayer in absentia, or a prayer at the grave is void of the reason which permits it to be prayed during that time. Isa also says, what seems to be obvious is that starting a prayer before the prohibited time will not invalidate the prayer if it is carried over into the prohibited time, but it will be sinful because you're praying in a prohibited time. So if you started with Takbiratul Ihram and you were just beginning your prayer, like the sun is at its peak, just as it's getting ready to peak, and you start it, it's still valid, but because now you're praying at a time in which was prohibited, there's a sin associated with it. And what that means is that if you started the prayer during the prohibited time, it would be invalid. Because when it comes to the aspects of worship, tahrim yufidul fasad. When it's prohibited, it necessitates, if you will, that it becomes invalidity, right? It becomes invalid, basically. So that concludes the section on awqat al-nahi, prohibited times, and various rulings associated with that. The next section here is entitled Bab fi Salat al-Jama'ah. Basically, congregational prayer. Also, its associated rulings and what permits foregoing congregational prayer, etc. Imam Buhuti rahimahullah ta'ala says, Salatul Jama'ati تلزم الرجال للخمس المؤدات مع القدرة لا شرط وله فعلها ببيته وأفضلها المسجد العتيق ثم الأكبر جماعة وأبعد أولى من أقرب. Okay? Performing the 5 obligatory prayers in congregation is required. تلزم الرجال, meaning it is an individual obligation upon men, free men, that is, أحرار, who are capable, مع القدرة, who are capable, they have the ability to do so. This, of course, excludes women. It's not obligatory upon women to attend congregational prayers. Those that are in between, hermaphrodites. Those in full or partial bondage, that's abd or muba'ad. And those possessing a legal excuse. And we'll talk about those at a later time. And this is based on a verse, this is verse number 102 in Surah An-Nisa, which states, وَإِذَا كُنْتَ فِيهِمْ فَأَقَمْتَ لَهُمُ الصَّلَاةَ فَلْتَقُمْ طَائِفَةٌ مِّنْهُمْ مَعَكَ. And when you are with them and you lead them in prayer, let one group of them pray with you. Again, Surah An-Nisa, this is chapter 3, verse number 102. And this is regarding prayer during battle, during combat. To establish prayer in congregation during combat. Some should be with you, even while holding weapons. So the imperative here, the command in this verse, as a standard, stipulates an obligation. فَلْتَقُمْ طَائِفَةٌ مِّنْهُمْ مَعَكَ stipulates an obligation. And being that this verse is in regards to the obligation of congregational prayer during times of fear, the obligation during times of peace and security is that much more strong. It's also obligatory while on a journey, while traveling, to pray in congregation. There's an abundant amount of evidence to support the obligatory nature of congregational prayer from the Quran and Sunnah. I've mentioned one of those here from the Quran for the sake of time. I won't mention any more, but there are many, many ahadith in which the Prophet ﷺ indicated the nature of the obligation to pray in congregation. And so it's required, as mentioned. But praying in congregation is not a prerequisite for the validity of prayer. This is based on a hadith which states congregational prayer is more virtuous than prayer alone by 27 times. Okay, that means that if you do pray alone without an excuse, your prayer is still valid. But because it's an obligation, it's sinful. So the requirement doesn't apply to the one with an excuse, a legal excuse to forego congregational prayer, because they will receive the reward of what they customarily do when they're not excused, which is based on a hadith which states that if the servant were to fall ill or travel, the reward of what they did when they were well or healthy and a resident will be recorded for them. It's collected by Imam Ahmad and al-Bukhari. So again, it's valid if you pray alone, but sinful without an excuse. If there is an excuse present, the reward will not be diminished based on the previously mentioned hadith. That with the excuse, you get rewarded the same as if you would pray normally. So what is a congregation? What is that? A congregation is established by two. Even if the imam is male and the other is a female, or a bondservant, based on the general nature of the hadith which states 2 or more make up a congregation, found in Sunan ibn Majah. So that means all it takes is 2. The exception to the rule, of course, is for Salat al-Jum'ah, for Friday prayer, and for Salat al-Eid. The prayer requires a much greater number for these two to be considered a congregation, which would be discussed when we get to that. But for those of you that know, it's 40. 40, not just any 40, but 40 people that are obliged to attend, meaning, and they are local, which means local men who are free. So that would exclude travelers and visitors from out of town, unless they became pseudo-residents, or women, etc., children. We'll get into the details of that later, inshallah. It's not considered a congregation for an obligatory prayer if the imam is pubescent and the second of the congregation is a child. So if you are baligh, meaning you've reached puberty, and the second person you're praying with has not reached puberty, that's not a congregation for an obligatory prayer. For a voluntary congregational prayer, it is valid that the child be the second member of a congregation. And this is based on a hadith which states that the Prophet ﷺ led Ibn Abbas when he was a kid in tahajjud prayer. It's reported that he led Ibn Abbas as a child in a voluntary prayer. It's also permitted for a young child to lead an adult in a voluntary prayer, but not the other way around. Even if there were more people to make up an actual congregation, let's say there were 3 people, 2 male adults and 1 young prepubescent male, like we would call him a boy, and it was Salat al-Dhuhr, for example, and they appointed the young boy to lead them in Salat al-Dhuhr, which is an obligatory prayer, then he's not a sufficient, suitable imam, right? And so it wouldn't work out. The child cannot lead an adult in an obligatory prayer, but if they were to do that for Taraweeh, for example, then that would be perfectly fine. And that's something that we'll look at in greater detail when we get to the following chapter on al-Imamah. It's recommended to pray in the masjid based on the evidence. We're talking about the obligatory nature of congregation and the recommended nature of doing so in the masjid. And there's a number of reasons for this. Number one, it creates larger congregations when we have a meeting place. We've established a masjid. That's a place to grow and build a congregation. And the larger the congregation is, the greater the reward. The second thing is that it publicizes the symbols of faith. When people come together for prayer, others witness that and they see. Publicizes the symbols of faith. It is, however, permissible to offer a congregational prayer at home. And this is based on hadith, general hadith, the earth has been made a place of prayer and purification for me. This is found in Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. So that means you can establish your own congregation in your own home. And there are cases when that is an obligation. Imam Bahuti says, if leaving the masjid would result in leaving your family alone, it makes sense to establish the prayer at home in order to fulfill the obligation of praying in congregation. It says, if leaving to the masjid would result in praying alone, while there is enough for a congregation at home, it's obligatory to stay home to perform the prayer in congregation. If you were to go to the masjid and you know you're going to be the only one there, while at home there's a wife and there's a kid and there's some adults and there's whatever it may be, there's your mother, your father, whoever it may be that's at home, then you've just left the obligation of congregation to come to the masjid, which is obviously recommended if you're going to pray in congregational prayer. It's recommended to do so in the masjid. However, now you're alone. And so in that case, you're obliged to perform the congregation back at the house. If leaving to the masjid results in praying in a smaller congregation than at home, in this case, praying in the masjid is preferred. So now we're not talking about greater congregation or smaller congregation when we're comparing the house or the masjid. The masjid will always be preferred to the home unless you're praying alone in the masjid. Praying in congregation is also recommended for women, the congregation which is away from men, whether they're led by them, by women, or not. And this is based on the actions of Aisha and Salama, which are mentioned by Imam al-Darqutni. There's also a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ ordered Waraqah to assign a mu'adhin for them and for her to lead the people of her family in prayer. So there was a woman congregation led by a woman. And that would be the only case, or in general, in which a woman would lead in prayer. There may be another scenario we'd run into in the next chapter. And this hadith we mentioned is found in Sunnah Abi Dawud, as well as by Imam al-Darqutni. It is disliked, however, when it comes to women attending congregational prayer, for a very attractive female to attend a congregation with men out of fear of temptation, out of fear of fitna. It's permissible for others to attend the congregational prayer, other women. Meaning, like, if she's ajuz, she's an elderly senior. Right? Because, we call a spade a spade. Islam is, this is the beauty of Islam, it comes to address how people are. Islam addresses how people are and not how we want them to be. Islam and the legal code of Islam addresses the nature, the real nature of human beings, and not a theoretical idea of what we should be. And so that concept, I don't want to dwell on this, but I think it's important to point out right here, that idea goes to show that we have to work together as men and women. We have to work together to avoid falling into sinful and devious behavior, especially when it comes to interactions with the opposite gender. What we would like to say, or the ideal would be, you can wear what you want and everyone would control themselves. Just wear what you want, or do what you want, or behave how you want, or present yourself in any manner that you want, and everyone will control themselves and be on their best behavior. That is the ideal. And even in Islam, that's the ideal. You're going to lower your gaze, you're going to guard your chastity, you're going to behave in a righteous way. But we know the reality is that won't happen. And we know that because there are certain punishments in place for people that break the law. And before we get to those punishments, we want to take necessary steps and adhere to a certain protocol so that we don't become fitna. We don't become the source of temptation even. Right? So in that way, Islam came to remove even the temptation of things. So this, of course, is something that should be taken into consideration. And anything other than that, any other thought or outlook which comes from outside of our tradition should be ignored. It should be ignored. And it should be taken as, sure, that's the ideal, but to try and deny or downplay the nature of human beings is more than likely a trick of shaitan. All right? And this ruling also applies to classes and gatherings where there's going to be other men present. So we're talking about a very attractive female who attends. If she's going to be among other men, then we may run into a potential scenario where that creates a temptation. Now, in the event that that is removed, that attractiveness, a scenario like ours where there's a separate section, then what we're dealing with is something very different. Where we have a separate section, women have a private area that they can sit, and even when everyone is here, if you remember, sometimes we're saying there's seating for the sisters here and for there and there, then ideally the women would understand the nature of this principle, and they say, okay, look, I am who I am, and I have places that I can go and places that I shouldn't go. And then they make their decisions based on that. It's recommended, we shift gears here, it's recommended for people residing in a Muslim border city. These are the cities that are along the border of Muslim and non-Muslim areas where it may be unsafe at the border. It's recommended that people residing in those border cities pray in one masjid. Pray in one masjid. Because doing so amplifies the Muslim voice. Meaning, it amplifies the Muslim presence. And it establishes dignity and veneration of others. When other people see us in large numbers, it lends itself to respect. They have presence. They have numbers. They have strength. They have organization and order. And so people would tend to venerate and respect the Muslims that are in those scenarios. And I think that this may have an application for us as well. Here, we're not in a Muslim border city, but we are in a scenario where we are in need of such respect and we are in need of such dignity and to amplify our voice. And so it's preferable that we are sticking together in communities as opposed to always breaking off into these smaller little pockets that are sometimes down the block. There's one masjid here, then down the block there's another masjid. We look divided. We look like there's no order. We look like there's no community. So there's going to be no real veneration and esteem. It looks, well, they're weak when they're separated, so no problem. And so that's another important thing to note, and it'll come up again, that kind of philosophy when we get to Friday prayer. He says, Ibn Qayyim says, for all others it is recommended to pray in the masjid which requires his presence for the congregation to be established. For all others, it's recommended to pray in the masjid which requires his presence for the congregation to be established. Meaning that if the congregation, it won't be a congregation, there'll be one person there, then the recommended masjid for you is to go to that masjid in order to make the congregation. And you doing that is a way in which you build or maintain the masjid. This is imaratul masjid. Min imaratul masjid, which is referred to in the Quran, in the book, in the verse. You know, when Allah says it is only for the believers to build or maintain the masajid. This is a way in which you build or maintain the masjid by maintaining the congregation and building the congregation in size. Another thing that's mentioned by Imam al-Muwafiq and al-Sharih, they said this also includes the masjid that is sufficiently attended, but they would miss that person's presence. Meaning if you didn't show up, you would be missed. And your absence would be a source of sadness. And so winning the hearts of the people here is preferred. Because now we're going to look at other masajid in terms of preference. The best congregational prayer in terms of location is in al-Masjid al-Atiq. And this is Masjid al-Haram. And this is because it is the first in terms of obedience. And so some would say al-Aqdam. Fal-Aqdam. The oldest, etc. Because it's the first or the oldest in terms of obedience being established there. This is followed by the largest congregation due to it being the greatest reward. And after that, the furthest away. The furthest of any two, regardless of their date of establishment or congregation size. In virtue, it would be the furthest away. And this takes precedence over the closest masjid. And this is based on a hadith which states, the greatest of those in terms of reward for prayer are those furthest away, and then those furthest away walking. And this is found in Sahih al-Bukhari. He says, وَحَرُمَ أَنْ يُؤَمَّ بِمَسْجِدٍ قَبْلَ إِمَامِهِ الرَّاتِبِ إِلَّا بِإِذْنِهِ أَوْ مَعَ عُذْرِهِ. It is impermissible to lead a prayer in the masjid, and this is talking about a masjid that has a resident imam. So it's impermissible to lead a prayer in the masjid before the resident imam concludes, and he concludes the prayer without his permission or in the presence of some excuse for him. So the resident imam is known as al-Imam al-Ratib. He is the one that has been assigned to be the imam of the masjid. Whether he's been employed to do so, or whether he's been appointed as a volunteer to do so, he's been recognized as this is the imam of the masjid. He has more right to lead because he is considered the same as Rabbul Bayt, which means the owner of the house or the lord of the house. And this is based on hadith which states a man is not to lead in the home of another man unless granted permission. Let's find this in Musnad Imam Ahmad. A man is not to lead in the home of another man, unless granted permission. So that means that you cannot lead in a masjid that has Imam al-Ratib unless he's granted you permission. It's not haram to lead prayer after the imam has concluded. So that means you're not allowed to do so before the imam leads the prayer. So you can't come in and lead Salat al-Dhuhr and the imam hasn't made Salat al-Dhuhr yet. You have to wait for the imam to make Salat al-Dhuhr before it becomes permissible. And here when he says, وَحَرُمَ أَنْ يُؤَمَّ بِمَسْجِدٍ قَبْلَ إِمَامِهِ الرَّاتِبِ, it's impermissible. What do you think that means if you do it? What's the state of the prayer that was made before Imam al-Ratib? If it's haram, al-hurma taqtadi al-fasad. It means it's invalid. So it's no minor offense. It's a major deal. According to the madhab, it's a major deal. However, like I said, if the imam is concluded, then it's permissible now to lead a congregation, like dhuhr. The imam has finished leading dhuhr prayer in the congregation, and now others are coming in, they're late or something, they're coming off the road, it's at an odd time after salat, they have to pray dhuhr. It's permissible, perfectly fine for someone to lead the congregation in prayer, unless the one doing so is doing it out of enmity toward the resident imam. Meaning they're intentionally leading another congregation because they don't like the imam. So what they're doing is basically gathering another congregation to challenge or rival the imam's leadership. And in this case, it would not be permitted. Or if he has permission from the imam, it's permissible. The imam is not led, or the imam is even there, and he permits someone to do it. The leadership of that person will be valid for the prayer. If the resident imam has an excuse for not praying in congregation, like he's ill, like he's sick, or he's late and the time is coming to a close, meaning the time of prayer is getting ready to exit, it's also permissible to lead the prayer. And this was demonstrated when Abu Bakr as-Siddiq led the prayer in the Prophet's absence, alayhi salatu wasalam. Also Abdurrahman ibn Auf, he did the same. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, ahsantum, good job. And this is found in Sahih Muslim. So at such a time when the prayer time is getting ready to exit, it becomes obligatory to perform the prayer regardless if they know of an excuse or not. If the imam is later than his normal time, the congregation, they can send a message to him if he's close by. If there's no hardship incurred, basically they're going to see if he's coming or if he grants permission for someone else to lead the prayer. And if not, meaning they can't send a message, or they don't think that he'll come, or they think that he won't mind if someone else leads, then they can pray. Someone else can lead the prayer. And in this case, the imam's right to leading the prayer has been foregone. Either he's granted permission, or the time has gone too long and it's getting ready to go out. The obligation to pray overrides the imam's right to lead them in prayer. You're not going to delay the prayer beyond its time. When I say delay the prayer, I mean delay it after its starting time, but not beyond its ending time, or its waqt al-mukhtar, into waqt al-darura. You're not going to get into the emergency time either because of that. It says, وَمَنْ صَلَّى ثُمَّ أُقِيمَتْ سُنَّ أَنْ يُعِيدَ غَيْرَ مَغْرِبٍ. So basically, if someone prays alone or in a congregation in the masjid, this kind of goes back to what was addressed earlier. It is recommended to repeat a prayer except Maghrib if it is established in a second congregation by the local imam or anyone else, even if it is during a prohibited time. A prohibited time for you. An example of that would be Salat al-Fajr or Salat al-Asr. Right? So that means basically you prayed in the masjid, you're in the masjid. That's a stipulation right there. Because we understand the nature of the prohibited times. This is a stipulation that you're in the masjid. You prayed alone or you prayed in congregation. And then the congregation is repeated. It's made again. There's a second congregation, for example. And whether that second congregation is led by the local imam or someone else, then it's recommended that you join the congregation. And this is based on hadith that I mentioned before. Perform prayer on time. And if it is established while you are in the masjid, then pray and do not say, I have already prayed, so I will not pray. If you don't join the congregation, it will appear as if you are making light of the congregation's sanctity. Or you could possibly be charged with denying the virtue of congregational prayer. A person may think, well, he doesn't even know, he doesn't understand the virtue of congregational prayer, or he doesn't believe in the reward of congregational prayer. Or he's making light of the congregation. So this recommendation applies even if you go to a masjid without the intention of repeating a congregational prayer. You're going to go to the masjid to meet someone, and the prayer is being established, then you're recommended to pray it. Unless, in this case, it's a prohibited time. Then it's no longer recommended for you to enter. The difference between the two scenarios is the first one, you were inside the masjid already. You were there, you had prayed. Then the congregational prayer was established again for a second time, even if it was a prohibited time. So you prayed Asr, whether you were alone or in congregation, and then you were hanging out in the masjid, and then a second congregation was established. For you, it is a prohibited time because you already prayed Asr. Remember, the prohibited time is from Salat al-Asr until the sun sets. And to repeat a congregational prayer, we'll see, is a recommendation for you. It's not the obligation. Obligation's been fulfilled. So because you're already in the masjid, this is the stipulation here, it's permissible. But if you prayed and you were outside of the masjid, now you're no longer recommended to come in to repeat that congregational prayer, which is a voluntary prayer, which would basically be performed during a prohibited time for you. So it's not recommended to go in and do it. So all of this can be done with the exception of Maghrib. Praying Maghrib is the exception of the rule because, as I said, repeating a prayer is a voluntary prayer. And voluntary prayers are not made in odd numbers. Witr is made in an odd number, but a nafila is not made in an odd number. If you remember, we talked about that during the voluntary prayer section. We said, if it is, it's valid, but they're made in sets of 2, or they can be made in 4 during the daytime. So you would not repeat Salat al-Maghrib. So if you were to repeat a prayer, as we mentioned, the first prayer that was performed fulfills the obligation, whether you were alone or in congregation, which means the second prayer is voluntary, and the intention must reflect that. If you're going to repeat the voluntary prayer, the intention is not going to be to fulfill your obligation, but it's going to be to repeat that prayer as a voluntary one. Imam Bahuti says, وَلَا تُكْرَهُ إِعَادَةُ جَمَاعَةٍ فِي غَيْرِ مَسْجِدَيْ مَكَّةَ وَالْمَدِينَةِ وَلَا فِيهِمَا لِعُذْرٍ. Okay, repeating a congregational prayer, this is kind of a follow-up, meaning making a second congregation in masjid that has a resident imam or not, whether there's a resident imam or there's not, is not disliked. It's not disliked to repeat a congregation, meaning to hold a second congregation in the masjid. Even if there is a Imam Ratib there, it is not disliked. Meaning it is allowable to hold a second congregation in a masjid. The first congregation was prayed, Salat al-Dhuhr for example, and then a group of people come in. It's permissible for them to hold a second congregation as opposed to praying alone or leaving. They can pray a second congregation inside of the masjid to fulfill the obligatory nature of congregational prayer. Because there are some that say you cannot hold a second congregation in a masjid. So the Hanabila, they put this here to address that issue. No, it's not disliked, let alone haram to do so. It's permissible to do so. Except in the two masjids of Mecca and Al-Medina, unless there's an excuse. Okay. Imam Ahmad's reasoning for this, meaning these two masjids being an exception, was to safeguard the congregations of Masjid al-Haram and Masjid al-Nabawi, preventing them from being diminished due to unexcused tardiness. Preventing the congregation size from being diminished, that people would just be holding multiple congregations due to the sheer volume of people that are there. They're like, oh, I'll just go 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, I'll figure it out, we'll find another congregation. It was made as an exception so that those congregations were maintained in their size and their large size and volume. Unless, of course, there's an excuse. If there is an excuse, even if this leads to multiple congregations, it's not disliked due to the obligatory nature of congregational prayer. If you had an excuse not to be there in attendance for congregational prayer at that time, then you can certainly do it later due to that excuse. It says, وَإِذَا أُقِيمَتِ الصَّلَاةُ لَمْ تَنْعَقِدِ النَّافِلَةِ وَإِنْ كَانَ فِيهَا أَتَمُّهَا إِنْ لَمْ يَخَفْ فَوْتَ الْجَمَاعَةِ. It says, وَإِنْ كَانَ فِيهَا أَتَمَّهَا إِنْ لَمْ يَخَفْ فَوْتَ الْجَمَاعَةِ. If the prayer is established, meaning the muqim, the one that makes the iqamah, begins the iqamah of the prayer that the person present wants to pray with the imam, a voluntary prayer, whether it's ratibah or any other voluntary prayer of the person who has not prayed that particular prayer. So like dhuhr, for example. You haven't prayed it. You want to pray it. You're in the masjid waiting for it. When the mu'adhin or the muqim begins to call the iqamah, a voluntary prayer cannot be started. It will not be convened. Lam tan'aqid al-nafila. Meaning once it's started, once the iqamah begins, if you even start the prayer, it doesn't count. This is based on the hadith which states if prayer is established, there is no other prayer except the obligatory prayer, which is muttafaqun alayh. If someone, and we're talking about the person that wants to join the congregational prayer, which is about to be established, is in a voluntary prayer. They're already praying the voluntary prayer. Even if they're outside of the masjid, they are to complete that prayer quickly without exceeding 2 rak'ahs. Remember we said you can have 2 or you can have 4, but in this case, because the prayer has just started, you're going to stick with the baseline voluntary prayer, which is 2 rak'ahs. You're allowed to finish it, but you have to do so quickly. Even if you fear missing a rak'ah, you can complete it, so long as you do not fear missing the congregation. So you're not going to miss the entirety of the prayer for the sake of your voluntary prayer. If you think that you're going to miss the congregation, you're going to abandon the voluntary prayer in order to make it to the congregational prayer. Remember what's voluntary and what's obligatory. Can you delay dhuhr for later? Yes, you're permitted to do so. But if this is the congregational prayer, then you're obliged to attend it, especially the one that you're seeking to pray with. They must abandon the voluntary prayer without completing it. وَمَنْ كَبَّرَ قَبْلَ السَّلَامِ إِمَامًا أَدْرَكَ الْجَمَاعَةِ وَإِنْ أَدْرَكَهُ رَاكِعًا أَدْرَكَ الرَّكْعَةِ. Whoever makes takbir with the imams before the imam's salam. So now we're talking about, right? So we just so you can understand the rationale behind this. Being late to prayer in general, because we said being late due to a voluntary prayer. Now, what about being late, not only for that cause, but in general? مَنْ كَبَّرَ قَبْلَ السَّلَامِ إِمَامٍ. Whoever makes takbir before the imam's salam. He's talking about the first salam, not the second. Because there's two, right? There's one on the right and there's one on the left. So if you make the takbiratul ihram before the imam says assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah for the first time, you have joined the congregation, meaning it counts as congregational prayer. If they make the takbir between the two taslims, meaning after the first, they have not. You're not in the congregation. Okay, it has to be done before the first taslim is made. He says then, وَإِنْ أَدْرَكَهُ رَاكِعًا أَدْرَكَ الرَّكْعَةِ. If they make ruku', joining him in ruku', the imam. So the latecomer, you're late, you're coming in. If you make ruku' while the imam is in ruku', meaning before he rises from ruku', such that both of you have reached the minimum requirements of ruku' before the imam has left the same position. So you have bowed enough, we talked about this before, to the point that the average sized person would be able to touch their hands to their knees. You're still not fully 90 degrees bowed over, but you've bowed enough to be considered in ruku'. You've made it to that point before the imam has risen from that point. He might be coming up, but his hands haven't left his knees. He's still considered raki'. And so if you meet that position that coincides, as long as it coincides there, you have joined that rak'ah. Even if you do not achieve tuma'nina, tranquility here, while the imam is coming up and you're coming down and you make it, even if you haven't reached that position in a tranquil state, then what you do is you achieve tranquility and then you proceed to follow after the imam, even though he's already stood up. And this, of course, is based on hadith which states whoever makes the ruku' has joined the rak'ah. It's found in Sunan Abi Dawud. Al-Buhuti rahimahullah ta'ala says, وَأَجْزَأَتُ التَّحْرِيمَةُ عَنْ تَكْبِيرَةِ رُكُوعٍ. Their opening takbir, this is takbiratul ihram, will suffice the takbir of ruku'. We discussed this previously. The opening takbir, which is called takbiratul ihram, or as it says here, at-tahrima, is sufficient for you to go into ruku'. Basically that means you're coming in late, you found that the imam is in ruku'. What do? Do you make one takbir or two? One takbir, which is takbiratul ihram, is enough. Allahu Akbar, and then you make ruku'. You're good. Okay? The important point is that the intention for that takbir is takbiratul ihram and not al-intiqal. That's not the first takbir you make, is not just to go into ruku'. If you did that, the prayer is not valid because you didn't make the ihram. Or if you combine the intentions together and you said, I'm going to make this takbir for ihram and for intiqal, then it would not be valid as well. It would not be convened as a prayer. The intention must be for ihram alone. That is sufficient. What is preferred is to make both. You make takbiratul ihram and then you make takbir al-intiqal, to move. First one for tahrima and the second one is to move. That's preferred. Now, you might find yourself in a scenario where you think, Well, if I wait to make the second one, I'll miss the rak'ah. The imam is getting ready to stand up. I can do one, but I can't do both. And in that case, go with the sufficient route, make the first takbirat al-ihram, join the ruku', and that will be enough for you, and you will have caught the rak'ah with the imam. Now, if you didn't get to that point, you came in late beyond the ruku', imam is not in ruku', imam is in sujood, for example. It's noted that if you find the imam in another position other than ruku', they are to fall into place without takbir, because they missed the time of takbir and it doesn't count anyway. The latecomer is recommended to join the prayer regardless of where the imam is in prayer. This is based on a hadith which says, the Prophet ﷺ says, if you come to prayer and we are in sujood, make sujood but do not count it. So if the imam is in sujood and you come, you join the prayer. You don't make takbir. What you're going to end up doing is when you stand up, you're going to make takbir. You're just joining the prayer. This doesn't count towards your prayer. Once the imam makes taslim, the latecomer moves to make up what he missed by making takbir. So when the imam says, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, then you're going to say, Allahu Akbar, for intiqal, and you're going to stand up. If they stand up before the imam makes the second taslim, without returning to sit, their prayer will become a voluntary prayer because they have abandoned the obligatory following of the imam. So the imam makes the first taslim. If you stand up, you stood up too early. If you refuse to sit back down for the second taslim, then the prayer, the obligatory nature of the prayer is invalidated, and now the prayer counts as a nafilah because you've missed an obligation here. It's important to note. You have to wait for the imam to conclude both the salam on the right and on the left. Another thing about coming late, that should be noted, is whatever they make will be the end of the prayer. Whatever you make with the imam will be the end of the prayer, and whatever they have to make up will be the first part of the prayer. So whatever rak'ah the imam is on, you're going to join on that rak'ah. So if it's number 3 and number 4, that will be number 3 and number 4 for you. And when you stand up, you're going to make up number 1 and number 2, which would require them to make the opening supplication. After the imam makes taslim, when you stand up, you begin with dua al-istiftah, at-ta'awudh, you seek refuge from the shaitan, recite a chapter after al-Fatiha, and this is based on a hadith which states, whatever you catch, pray, and whatever you miss, make up. It's qada. This is found in Musnad Imam Ahmad and Sunnah Nasa'i. Important note about this. It is the first part of the prayer requiring you to do those things I mentioned. Dua al-istiftah, at-ta'awudh, and qira'at al-surah ba'd al-Fatiha, reciting another chapter after al-Fatiha. You are, however, to maintain the general appearance of prayer in terms of the tashahhud. So if you catch one rak'ah of a 4 rak'ah prayer or one of maghrib, they must make the tashahhud after the last tashahhud they caught, so that you don't end up prayer in an odd manner. In the prayer with no tashahhud, for example. So you have to maintain the general appearance of prayer. That the first rak'ah, even if that is the last, there's a tashahhud, and you have to stay there because the imam's doing it, and that's the 4th one. But when you stand up for the next one, that appears to be the second rak'ah that is being prayed, even though it may be your makeup first. So we distinguish between the two here. It's the second rak'ah prayed, but it's the makeup of the first rak'ah. So because it's the second rak'ah being prayed, there's a tashahhud there, etc. So you have to maintain that kind of order. And really what you just have to be aware of is, I'm going to pray like it normally would be in terms of 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, But if I miss the first and the second, I'm going to make up those additional things that are not normally prayed in the third or the fourth, depending on the prayer that was missed. Goes on and he says, وَيَتَحَمَّلُ الْإِمَامُ عَنْهُ قِرَاءَةَ الْفَاتِحَةِ. The Imam will shoulder for them, meaning he will shoulder for the congregation the recitation of Al-Fatiha. And this means that the congregant's prayer is valid without them reciting Al-Fatiha. The congregation's prayer is valid, the congregant's prayer is valid, even if they don't recite Al-Fatiha. And this is based on the verse, وَإِذَا قُرِيَ الْقُرْآنُ فَاسْتَمِعُوا لَهُ وَأَنْصِتُوا لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ. When the Quran is being recited, listen to it attentively and being silent so that you may be shown rahmah. Surah Al-A'raf, chapter 7, verse number 204. And there's also a hadith which states the Imam has been positioned to be followed. So if he makes takbir, make takbir, and if he recites, listen attentively. This is Rawahul Khamsa illa Tirmidhi. And the hadith which states whoever has an Imam, the recitation of the Imam will be his recitation, found in Musnad Imam Ahmad. And this hadith is mursal. However, mentioned by Ibn Qa'id, he says it is hujjah indana. According to Hanabila, they use this as an evidence. This hadith which states, whoever has an Imam, the recitation of the Imam will be his recitation. So coupled with everything else, they utilize that as well. So وَيُسَنُّ أَن يَقْرَأَ فِي إِصْرَارِ إِمَامِهِ وَسَكَتَاتِهِ وَإِذَا لَمْ يَسْمَعْهُ لِبُعْدٍ أَوْ طَرَشٍ مَا لَمْ يَشْغَلْ مَنْ بِجَنْبِهِ. Okay, we'll stop right there. He says, it is preferred that one, وَيُسَنُّ أَن يَقْرَأَ فِي إِصْرَارِ إِمَامِهِ. It's preferred that one, meaning the congregant, read when the Imam is silent. When's the Imam silent? In Dhuhr and Asr. Imam's silent there. That's sakatat. You're thinking about sakatat, when he pauses. Silent pauses. This is when, fi israrihi, when he is silent, fi israri imamihi, and that is in Dhuhr and Asr, or the silent rakas of al-Maghrib and Isha. So the third of al-Maghrib and the third and fourth of Salat al-Isha. The Imam is silent during those times. Right? This is based on hadith of Jabir, who said during the first two rakahs of Dhuhr and Asr, behind the Imam, we would recite Al-Fatiha in another chapter, and in the last two, we would read Al-Fatiha, Sunnah Ibn Majah. Imam al-Tirmidhi said the majority of the scholars side with reciting behind the Imam. And they are also recommended to recite during his silent pauses. This is when he says, وَسَكَتَاتِهِ. During his silent pauses, which are present in an audible prayer, such as Al-Fajr, or Salat al-Jum'ah, Rak'atay, Al-Maghrib al-Isha, the first two of Al-Maghrib al-Isha when the Imam is reading aloud. So the Imam has three silent pauses. We're not talking about Dhuhr and Asr. We're talking about now the audible prayers. Three silent pauses in prayer. The first is before Al-Fatiha in the first rak'ah. The Imam makes the takbir, and then there's a pause. Because there's Dua al-Istiftah, Ta'awudh, Basmala, etc. There's going to be a pause there. So this is Sakatat al-Imam. And the second one is after that. The second one is after Al-Fatiha. After the Imam reads Al-Fatiha, there's going to be a pause. And the duration of that pause is equivalent to Al-Fatiha, in order to give the congregant time to read Al-Fatiha. Recommended. It's recommended. These pauses are not obligatory pauses. These are recommended. And the third is after the surah is completed. After Al-Fatiha, it recites another chapter, and then there's a pause there. Imam al-Buhuti says the duration of that pause is enough for the congregant to recite an additional chapter as a recommendation. Be long enough for the congregant to recite a chapter, whether it's Qul huwa Allahu ahad, wal asr, inna a'tainaka al-kawthar, or whatever. So those are the three pauses that you would find the Imam perhaps practicing. So if you find that the Imam's paused, you'll know why the Imam's doing that. He's giving you time to fulfill a recommendation of reciting behind him, fi sakatatihi. The congregant is also recommended to recite what has been mentioned. Right? And that means Al-Fatiha, etc. when the imam cannot be heard due to distance. If you are far from the imam, you're in the congregation, but you're so far you can't hear, then you recite. You're not able to hear, so you're not going to be obliged to listen attentively. So you can read. Or deafness. The person is deaf, they can't hear anyway, so long as their recitation does not distract those nearby, meaning they don't distract the other congregants in prayer. If their recitation does distract them, then the recitation is foregone. They will not do it. Another thing to note about this voluntary recitation is that if the imam concludes the recitation before the congregant concludes their recitation, the imam makes ruku'. The congregant is to follow the imam without completing the recitation. Okay, so if you're reading a selection of the Quran and the imam makes ruku', you're obliged to follow the imam, not obliged to conclude your selection. You decided you're going to read a chapter, al-Mutaffifin, for example, and you are halfway through, the imam makes ruku'. You don't stand there to conclude what you intended to read. You say, well, I intended I was going to read the whole thing, so I'm going to just rip on, and we'll see where it lands us. Yeah, basically. The prayer's over before you're done. But you're obliged to follow the imam. And the hadith is obviously clear. The imam was positioned to be followed. This is different from the tashahhud. This must be completed if the imam makes taslim. The tashahhud. If the imam makes taslim before you're done, then you have to complete the tashahhud and then make the taslim. When it comes to the dua after the tashahhud. Unless there's something very brief remaining, if the congregant has remaining supplications to be made, they are to forego them and conclude the prayer with the imam. Meaning, unless it's something very small, a supplication that you're still making, and the imam has made taslim, you can make a little bit more dua, then you have to make taslim. If you have this long dua going, you have to forego that dua and follow the imam. Again, the hadith states the imam has been made to be followed. So, following the imam means doing it after the imam, which would give you enough time to conclude something very brief. But going way beyond the imam and then making taslim, it's obvious you're no longer following the imam, but you're now doing your own thing. You've gone rogue. He says, وَيَسْتَفْتِحُ وَيَسْتَعِيذُ وَلَوْ فِي مَا يَجْهَرُ فِيهِ إِمَامُهُ. The opening supplication and seeking your refuge are to be said, meaning it is recommended for the congregant to say them in every prayer, even in that prayer which the imam is audible in, like al-Fajr. These things are also recommended for you to say. And this is done typically in the silent pauses of the imam, or due to deafness or distance, as was previously mentioned. So not only is it the recitation, but we're also talking about al-istiftah, and then we have a ta'awudh, the various supplications that are made as well. And of course, this is typically done in the first pause of the imam after the opening takbir. So, as I mentioned, the first pause, silent pause, is he makes takbir, and then there's a pause before he begins reading al-Fatiha. So the imam, he says, Allahu Akbar, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. There's no pause there for the congregant to make these supplications. Now, obviously, they're not going to do that in the event that he just goes right into the recitation. But part of the imam's job, which we're going to look at shortly, is to consider the congregants behind him. Is to have concern and care for the congregants behind him. So, the imam would allow some time for the congregation to make their supplications, read al-Fatiha, etc., by providing them with these various pauses. He goes on, al-Buhuti says, وَمَنْ رَكَعَ أَوْ سَجَدَ وَنَحْوُهُ قَبْلَ إِمَامِهِ عَمْدًا حَرُمَ وَعَلَيْهِ أَنْ يَرْجِعَ لِمُتَابَعَةٍ كَنَاسٍ ذَكَرَ. He says, whoever intentionally bows or prostrates, etc. Another example would be rises or raises from ruku' or from sujood before the imam, which is impermissible, he says, haruma, if this is done intentionally, must return to following the imam, just like people who have done so and then they remember, meaning they've done so forgetfully or heedlessly and then they remember. And this is based on hadith which states, do not make ruku' or sujood or stand before me. As the Prophet ﷺ said, it's found in Sahih Muslim. There's another hadith that states, is the one who raises their head before the imam not afraid that Allah will change his head into that of a donkey and then change his body into that of a donkey? This is muttafaqun alayh. Warning them about the severity, the severe nature of doing so. Preceding the imam, going before the imam. So we talked about delaying, a long delay behind. Now we're talking about before. It says, if they return, as he mentions here, they must return. This was alluded to. In order to do what the imam did after he did it, the prayer would be valid. فَإِن لَمْ يَرْجِعْ عَمْدًا بَطَلَتْ. If they intentionally do not return while knowing of its obligation, it is invalidated because they have abandoned an obligation without excuse. And so from the above stated ruling, doing something before the imam, the obligatory nature of returning to the follower, the congregant, it's understood that if one refused, this was done intentionally, if one did not return out of ignorance, they didn't know the ruling of it, or they did not return due to ghafla or heedlessness, the prayer would still be valid. Basically, they would be excused. The only case in which it becomes invalid for you to do that is when it's done intentionally. What's preferred is that the congregant begin the acts of prayer after the imam. They follow the imam. Doing them in sync with the imam is disliked. It's makruh. So there's a distinction between the general acts of prayer and takbiratul ihram, right, regarding what is said. If one makes ihram before or with the imam, takbiratul ihram, before or with, the prayer is not convened. So you can't make takbiratul ihram with the imam. So we're talking about the things that are said. The things that are done, right, doing them with the imam is makruh. Doing them after the imam was mustahab. He's bowing and you're bowing at the same time. It's makruh. You intentionally bowing before him requires you to go back and then bow again after him. Not doing so intentionally invalidates the prayer. But what is said, the words that are said, the ihram, it has to be done after. It cannot be done before or with. The prayer will not count. If one were to make taslim before the imam without excuse or due to heedlessness and does not return, the prayer is invalid. If it is done alongside of the imam, making taslim, it is disliked but valid. Understand the scenario here? If you make this taslim with the imam, it's valid but disliked. If you make taslim before the imam, it's invalid. And you do not return back. You can return to follow, and that would be fine. But if you don't return, the prayer is invalidated. If you don't have an excuse, you've basically left the imam's leadership. It's permissible to make this is a thing that happens all the time. It is permissible to make the first salam after the imam completes the first taslim. It's permissible. So the imam says, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's now permissible for you to say, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, to make the first. And then wait until he says the second one for you to say the second one. What is recommended, however, is for you to wait for the imam to complete both taslims, the one on the right and one on the left, and then you make the one on the right and the one on the left. That's what's recommended. What's permitted is you do one per one. Whatever else is said in the prayer, so we talked about three things, takbiratul ihram, and we talked about, takbiratul ihram and taslim, what's said. Anything else that's said, if it's done before the imam, it's of no consequence. It doesn't matter. So like al-Fatiha, for example. If you're reading al-Fatiha, fi sakatatihi, if it's the first pause, if you have a long pause for dua al-istiftah, and you read al-Fatiha there, before the imam read it, it's of no consequence. The prayer is valid, no problem. If you know, for example, the Imam gives you that sakta al-ula, and there's no sakta thaniya, he gives you the first pause but never gives you second pause, well, guess what? Take advantage of the first pause, read al-Fatiha. No consequence, you're good to go. It says, وَإِن رَكَعَ وَرَفَعَ قَبْلَ إِمَامِهِ عَمْدًا بَطَلَتْ وَسَهْوًا أَوْ جَهْلًا يَقْضِي الرَّكَعَ. If one, a congregant, intentionally bows and rises from ruku', he says, رَكَعَ وَرَفَعَ قَبْلَ إِمَامِهِ, meaning before the Imam makes ruku'. You've made ruku' and rise from ruku'. You've already done the whole thing. Before the Imam, the prayer is invalidated. If you've done it amdan, intentionally. And this is because they preceded the Imam in an entire pillar. Remember, if you did it amdan and then you go back, you're fine. If you did it amdan and you didn't go back, then you're not. But now if you did it for this scenario where you've completed the entire ruku', like if you bowed before him but you didn't rise amdan, you bowed and then you realize, oh, I'm done, I did it before, I need to go back. Allahu Akbar, Sami Allahu liman hamida. One is Allahu Akbar, oops, go back. But here you've made the whole rak'ah, you've made the whole ruku'. This is just like one who intentionally precedes the Imam with the taslim. Again, we talked about that before. It says, if the bowing and rising before the Imam is done unintentionally or ignorantly, the prayer is not invalidated, but the rak'ah must be made up after the Imam makes taslim if they did not return to follow the Imam in that particular act. If they were able to return to perform it after the Imam, the rak'ah is counted. This rule only applies to ruku' because ruku' is the bulk of the rak'ah. And it's by which a rak'ah is either caught or missed. Okay, it's not the same for sujood, etc. This is specific to making the rak'ah and then rising from it. He says, وَسُنَّ تَطْوِيلُ أُولَى عَنْ ثَانِيَةٍ وَلِإِمَامٍ التَّخْفِيفُ مَعَ الْإِتْمَامِ وَانْتِظَارُ دَاخِلٍ إِن لَمْ يَشُقْ. It's preferred for the Imam, congregant, an individual, to make the first, everybody. وَسُنَّ تَطْوِيلُ أُولَى عَنْ ثَانِيَةٍ. It's preferred, in general, to make the first rak'ah longer than the second. This is based on hadith which states he recited al-Fatiha in the first two of Dhuhr, and would make the first rak'ah longer than the second. And this was the case for Asr as well as Fajr, muttafaqun alayh. Abu Dawood, he added, we assumed that he wanted people to be able to catch the first rak'ah. This is not the case for the fear prayer. In some scenarios of the fear prayer, it's recommended to make the second slightly longer. The difference, like when you recite Surah Al-A'la and Surah Al-Ghashiyah. Surah Al-A'la is shorter than Surah Al-Ghashiyah. So you made the second one longer here in this case. So in the fear prayer, in some scenarios, it's preferred that the first one be shorter and the second one be longer. It's also recommended for the Imam to be expedient or quick in prayer, but complete in prayer. Not rushed to the point that the prayer is starting to collapse, but to be quick so that people are not overburdened. And this is based on a hadith which states, if one of you leads people in prayer, be expedient, for the congregation includes the ill and the weak and those with a pressing need. If they pray alone, they can pray as long as they like, as reported by al-Jama'ah, the major collections of hadith. That means the Imam is looking out for the congregation's well-being and attentive to their needs. He's not going to burden them with a long prayer. Doing so would run them away from attending the congregational prayer in the masjid. If the congregation, all of them, everyone present said, we want a long prayer, agreed to a long prayer, then that illah would be absent. Then it would be okay for the Imam to read a very long prayer. But all of the congregation would have to agree to such a condition. Otherwise, the Imam is to be expedient with prayer and to do what the Prophet ﷺ typically did. And that's why it was so important when we talked about the description of prayer of what should be recited in prayer beyond al-Fatiha. You'll find that normally it's from Juz Amma. That's what's normally read in prayer, unless of course, Salat al-Maghrib and Salat al-Fajr, shorter and then longer. And it's recommended that the imam wait for anyone coming in. Meaning if the imam senses that someone is entering while he's in ruku', so long as it does not cause difficulty, he should wait. And waiting like this while the imam is in ruku' was reported from the Prophet ﷺ during the fear prayer in order that they could catch the congregation. And the same reasoning for him to wait during the fear prayer is present in the other prayers, so long as it does not place undue hardship on the congregation. You consider the congregation first and not the tardy person, because the congregation's sanctity of, if you will, or hurma, is of greater importance and gets precedence over a person that's coming late. It was also reported that the Prophet ﷺ would stand in the first rak'ah for dhuhr until he no longer heard the sound of footsteps. He would be standing there praying in the qiyam position until it became silent, meaning that everyone was in. And this is found in Musnad Imam Ahmad and Sunnah Abi Dawud. The last point to mention is when استأذنت امرأة لمسجد كره منعها وبيتها خير لها. If a woman, be she free or a bondservant, be she a spouse or otherwise, seeks permission to go out during the day or night in order to attend the masjid, it is disliked for him to prevent her from doing so. It's disliked. Note, وَإِنِ اسْتَأْذَنَتْ Whoops. If she sought permission, that means the first step is there's a permission sought. That means there is a permission to be taken. كُرِهَ مَنْعُهَا is disliked. Meaning, it's not prohibited. If there's a reason the man does not want his wife to attend the masjid, it's not prohibited for him to say no. There may be a number of reasons. It's not time to get into that. It's disliked, however, to prevent her from doing so. I mean, obviously, most people would want the women of his household to attend the masjid, especially if there's going to be a great benefit in doing so. And this is based on hadith which states, do not prevent the female servants of Allah from the masajid of Allah. Though her house is better for her, it's based on another hadith which states their homes are better for them, and go out malodorous. It's reported by Imam Ahmad and Abu Dawud, meaning if the woman's going to go out of the home, she should do so in a malodorous fashion, meaning she's not perfumed. If they go out, they should do so without being perfumed or wearing beautiful, attractive clothing. And again, that goes back to the idea of working hand in hand with your community, both men and women together, to avoid temptation and devious behavior. You don't want to be the source of someone's evil thoughts or sinful actions. And that's where we will conclude for the evening. Jazakallah khair. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad.